Our haters have been calling this, Eric, the Great Irish Apology Tour. And this is just a classic case of slander where, once again, they misinterpret what we said. I'm not sure what we said, but I know they're paraphrasing us and not quoting us directly. That I can be sure of. One of us, or both of us, probably we doubled down on it. We were merely questioning the Irish famine, the potato famine, and we were just asking the very tough questions other people weren't, such as whether or not it happened. And that caused such a backfire. Completely independent of that, we have a beautiful, wonderful, just so happens to be Irish guest here today, Alan Flanagan.
Yeah, and some might say that this is actually a two-pronged PR stunt on our part because he also happens to be the co-host of Sigma Nutrition with none other than Danny Lennon.
Right. Yeah,
I actually forgot about that. That apparently, I don't know, maybe it was like at least 2 decades ago with the previous co-hosts of Iron Culture, the shock jocks that we let go of.
Yeah.
So I think that would be a tenuous connection at best to say that this is us still trying to, deal with the repercussions of supposed slander, potential truth against Danny Lennon. So, is there any? I mean, if you look at our guests recently, I think it's random. We had Connor Heffernan on twice.
Yeah, where's he
Alan
from, Eric?
Flanagan on. I honestly, I don't remember. I don't think we should. Correct.
He teaches out of Austin.
I don't see nationality personally. So
yeah, and I can't detect regional dialects. So to me, he has a very kind of rustic, if I was to interpret it correctly, Connor Heffernan, very rustic, old-timey almost American Southern drawl when he talks. So
yes, yeah, absolutely. That's what I heard too. I was thinking maybe a hint of Cajun, perhaps.
Yeah.
Somewhere, maybe on his father's side, not to be too specific.
Yeah.
But no, in all seriousness, folks, I'm actually pretty excited about this episode. For those who don't listen to Sigma Nutrition Radio, it's a really, really good deep dive into not only the science of nutrition and a lot of public health topics as they relate to nutrition, but also they do a lot of good stuff on, like, I would say, metascience, kind of understanding how scientific data is determined, and how it is utilized and how to interpret it, and really how it should inform evidence-based practice rather than the way it often does. So I would say this episode is probably a good follow-up to the problem with hashtag science that we did back in the day with Brad Dieter and Andy Galpin.
Yes.
So Alan Flanagan, like I said, he's the co-host with Danny on Sigma Nutrition. He's a PhD candidate at Surrey. And he used to be a lawyer, so he's got a solid basis in logic, and he also powerlifts. So, I mean, if that's not a cool trifecta, I don't know what is. But anyway, I heard him on Sigma Nutrition Radio multiple times. They had a great episode about understanding causation, because I think we tend to, maybe in the evidence-based community, we use the heuristics, things like the hierarchy of evidence, things like understanding causation versus correlation, a lot of other things you'll hear repeated. Sometimes we look at those a little too uncritically, and as though we're almost following rules without thought to what those rules are supposed to represent. What are the underlying principles of them? So in addition to that episode, there was also a great episode on Sigma Nutrition Radio where they talked about meta-analyses. And I think those two really just impressed me. Alan did a great job, and we got him on to talk more about that and really get in depth. So those of you who are already going down the rabbit hole of trying to use science in practice, I think this will help you make better conclusions. And it'll also help you see when someone is, I would say, abusing or misunderstanding. I don't want to always spin it as though it's purposeful. Some of the ways that data can be interpreted and to fit a narrative or a bias, intentionally or unintentionally, and how you can get better at avoiding that.
Let me just co-sign this, Eric. And, we joke a lot about Danny, but he's been putting out some straight fire Sigma Nutrition and Alan Flanagan. Look, everything that Eric said, plus if you want to learn how to win arguments better, there's no better place than to learn from a lawyer. I think we go anywhere and everywhere with this conversation too, which is kind of just the way Iron Culture works. where it's everything Eric overviewed and oh so much more. So even if you're thinking to yourself, yeah, I have a decent interpretation of bro, I just want to get them gains, there's a lot of insight to be had here. And by the end of it, I mean, we felt there could be another part, but we had it, we're teasing people because we're trying to adhere to the basics of just solid marketing. So give the people what they want, but not everything, and leave them maybe wanting a little more. So we have a 2-hour episode, and there's still more to be covered.
Yeah, and we're just big teases too. Also, I think we probably need a very mild trigger warning on this one. We do discuss politics in this episode. However, it is not the intention to sway you towards any political belief or ideology. Rather, it's to point out in some of the more common political belief systems how there's often logical inconsistencies, beliefs that are held at the same time that seem to conflict, at least philosophically. So we could have given more examples on multiple sides, but if you did feel as though your personal beliefs were attacked, just remember the main message was that if all of your beliefs politically line up across one ideology, you may be overusing heuristics and rather than thinking each situation critically and the specific evidence on it. And it is truly just a foil to understand these concepts. So please don't send us messages. I've been called a cuck too many times in this lifetime, and I just don't want it anymore. So I know if you need to, maybe what you can do, write a draft.
Yep.
And I fully encourage you to express that anger and then delete it. You'll feel a ton better. And in general, that's probably a good idea for the internet.
And if anyone ever says that shit to my boy Eric once again, I'm going to find you, and it's scorched earth policy. I'm going to annihilate you, your loved ones, everything you've ever known, erase you from the face of the earth, and no one will ever remember you. So that's not a threat. That's just a fact, because that's the way we roll around here. I got my boy's back, whether he wants it or not. I'm always in the shadows, ready with that dagger. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Anyways, just stay loose, everyone. Have a great time. Enjoy this episode. Whatever. Peace, love, happiness, all that good stuff. Eric, do you mind if I start with some politics?
No.
Great. Okay, so let's just get right into it. I'm going to explain optics and how it works. So those that, once again, are not tuning in for the video, you're missing out on the YouTube, but we have Captain America, the man hung every day for me, Eric Helms, in the house. We have what looks like and can only be described as Tony Stark in the house too, Alan Flanagan. There are some people that I'm getting ahead of the controversy by just addressing it and by stating that there is, in fact, no controversy, that we're not doing the great Irish apology of some people have been claiming that, we never, Alan, I just want to be clear, we never explicitly denied the potato famine in the 1800s. We were merely asking the tough questions that, once again, other people are too soft to ask. And I think Alan, I think you could relate to this because there have been accusations, and I'm not sure if you want to address it, and I think you're just doing a fantastic job in terms of the optics, how you're presenting yourself, in terms of humanizing your co-host, Danny Lennon, because there were people, and we're just saying people very broadly, not specifically indicating who it was leveling those accusations, that said that, Danny Lennon may have been a serial killer, that he may be, in fact, a serial killer. And I think some people might look at your addition. Yeah, PhD candidate, great choice, very knowledgeable, can only add to Sigma Nutrition. Why not? Why not have Alan on? There might be those that say it's to soften the edge and to prove once and for all that Danny can interact more than a few times with any individual without, thinking of doing something. So you're there for damage control. And yes, in the background, you might have a Charlie Brown Christmas tree to once again humanize you a little bit. And you might have the cool red shades on that kind of gives you that cyberpunk. Just a yes or no question for you, Alan. Have you ever played the video game Deus Ex?
I have not.
Okay. So we're going from there. Anyways, they might say that, but this is all coincidence, Eric. This is all mere coincidence. And anyone that's trying to, piece together these separate elements into some grand unified theory against us, they're barking up the wrong tree.
Yeah, I think you said that well, Omar. And honestly, it's no coincidence that the most recent episode at the time of recording this, coming out of Sigma Nutrition, is about conspiracy theories. So if you think there's some grand conspiracy going on here, there's not. Take a listen. And don't worry that the conspiracy you're thinking of is related to people telling you not to believe in conspiracy theories. Right. Again, just another unique coincidence that's going on. Yeah. So with that lovely pseudo introduction, Omar, to address the controversy, to get ahead of it, now we can have a conversation. And I just want to say, Alan, it's an honor to have you on. In all seriousness, I love your addition to Sigma Nutrition. I was enthralled as much as any nerd can be in your discussion about causation, your discussion about meta-analyses, and just the overall kind of meta conversation around methodology, epistemology, and what it means to be evidence-based and how to actually take evidence into practice. So it's been a long time since we've had a meta conversation about that. So yeah, I just want to say welcome to Iron Culture. By the way, folks, he is a powerlifter. He belongs here. He's one of the people. But he's also, you're very welcome. If you didn't, you would not be. But you do, so you are. And yeah, just thanks for coming on.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I like the meta level conversations are probably my favorite rabbit hole to go down for multiple reasons. But I think when it comes to nutrition, particularly and nutrition science, I mean, it's probably the most vogue field that you could get outside of the discipline of science itself, just because everyone eats, everyone's their own expert, and everyone likes to lay claim to like, oh, here's this study, you know. And so social media obviously adds to that. If you were listening to Danny's episode with Dr. David Robert Grimes, they would have, dug into really the damage that social media is doing to our conversations. And I think, this has been probably on our radar since 2016 in Europe and the US. But if you pay attention to just the average debate over a fairly either uncontroversial topic in nutrition, or even a topic where there is some gaps in the evidence, or there are some contradictions that we need to reconcile, it's very difficult to try and reconcile that with any sort of measured dialogue, and so I think the reason we've started taking much more of a meta approach, and we've gone through, as you said, some issues to do with how to think about causality in nutrition as a science, kind of biosciences, meta-analyses. We're going to do one soon on prospective cohort studies, which I think everyone is going to need to listen to, because unless you can do a 50-year RCT anytime soon, where you control for every variable for 50 years, just get over it. Like, prospective cohort studies are going to be a mainstay of investigating long-term diet-disease relationships for the foreseeable future. So, understanding these methodology, they're simply data points that they're giving us, ways of looking at an issue and adding it into the evidential puzzle and seeing what comes together. And yet we end up with these really entrenched positions, oversimplified versions of what's good evidence and what's not, fairly dismissive lines of it. It depends on the kind of in-group bias you're dealing with, but if we're talking about, say, kind of low carb, cholesterol denialism, then we're just dealing with a complete dismissal of an entire totality of evidence. If we're dealing with other areas where there's a little bit more in the evidence that needs to be reconciled, and an example would be on that would be sodium and cardiovascular disease, where within the debate, there's genuine debate. There's, unlike the cholesterol kind of conversation, no one really denies hypertension's a legitimate risk factor, and also no one really denies that very high. So, but within this conversation, you get a debate about current thresholds, public health recommendations, blah blah blah. You can only really reconcile that evidence if, for example, you really understand measurement error for sodium in nutritional epidemiology. But I see people weighing in on this conversation with really, really kind of hard and fast conclusions, and they absolutely have not the first idea of what the correlation coefficient for sodium in most cohort studies is. You can't reconcile that question unless you're getting to grips with this stuff. What tends to come back is observational research bullshit anyway, and it's just like, well, then just leave. Like, you don't need to be. If that's the answer, then you don't have really any business being part of a conversation trying to reconcile this evidence. So part of that is something we alluded to before, that the hierarchy of evidence is treated as a standard of proof and as a fixed object. Oh, well, this trial's above that on that pyramid, therefore that's better evidence. That's not the case at all, because the quality of that particular evidence needs to be weighed up. And I think it's important that we have these conversations at this meta level, because everyone is evidence-based, and that's the vogue, is being evidence-based. And we need to, if you're someone who relies on good sources to apply in practice, then we need to be able to communicate that well enough to people that they're comfortable in what they're applying. And then secondly, it also means that for the wider dialogue, where people are more interested in the scientific side, not necessarily just the kind of practical application side, then we need to be able to have an understanding of these issues. Otherwise, we can't reconcile conflicts in the evidence. So it's an ongoing project, but I think that the biggest missing link for me in so many of the conversations, not just random kind of, comment threads on Twitter or Instagram, but even wider legitimate conversations within the kind of evidence and science-based community, is probably a failure of epistemology that's driving a lot of the dialogue that we have. And I think if we can get to a better epistemic grasp of what evidence is, what purpose it serves, then we can probably reconcile some of these conflicts with a bit more, with a bit less controversy.
I think that's, man, you provided a lot of potential entry points for us to address this. And this being the understanding of things, understanding how we know what we know. And the potential here is for this to turn into a conversation that is very, not just daunting, but also like, okay, bro, you gave me all these, bro being me in this case, that's what people call me if you weren't sure. Okay, bro, Eric, you gave me all these tools, these heuristics, which we'll talk about in a second, and we've talked about before in Iron Culture, to better understand and navigate all of the theory, concepts, and potential tools I have as a practitioner or as an athlete. And now you're telling me, okay, guess what? You used the tools wrong, so let me take that back. And now we're just going to have a high-level conversation that's over your head. And basically now you've just lost confidence in this thing that you made your new sacred cow. And don't worry, I'm starting at the end here, because we're going to take your safety blanket away, dear listener, but we're going to give it back to you, and you're going to be a slightly more adult at the end of it, and you will find that safety blanket isn't as needed, and you will know the limits of your safety blanket. Just for example, if you were a child and you had a safety blanket and you crossed the street when you weren't supposed to, if you held that safety blanket up in front of the car, you'd still get hit by the car. So that's the analogy we're going to roll with here, is children getting hit by cars, because it's just appropriate and not at all morbid.
Better than drowning.
Yep.
Yeah.
I don't know who would say something like that, Omar. That's inappropriate. But the use of a safety blanket can make you feel better. It can help you go to sleep. And it certainly can nullify the sense of, oh, mommy's not here right now. She's at the grocery store, but I'm okay because I have Banky. I'm speaking from personal experience. But we need to arm ourselves a little better against some other potential issues. So what I'm getting at, you talked about the evidence-based hierarchy, and this is something that I think is incredibly useful for anyone who wants to use science in their practice. And just as a recap for everyone listening, so we can kind of dive into some of the ways it's potentially misused. We have this, imagine a triangle. I'm not going to say pyramid, because I don't want to have to sue the evidence-based community for taking my copyrighted image. Shape, I should say. But we'll say we have a triangle. At the peak of the triangle is the meta-analysis and systematic review. Below that is randomized controlled trials. Below that is other types of controlled trials. Below that, we have various classes of observational research. And below that, we have anecdotal research. And I think that's a very useful way of looking at things, because when you're in a conversation in many, but not all topics, where you're trying to figure out what you might do as a trainer or nutritionist, if you have a body of evidence showing, something to be better or worse than something else, or more appropriate in a given situation, or a useful intervention in a given clinical situation, you probably want to go with a thing that has a meta-analysis or two behind it, or at least a handful of RCTs, rather than something like an anecdote or observation. So, Alan, this is where we'll use that entry point. You talked about prospective cohort studies, which are observational. They're epidemiological. They are controlled in the sense that we're trying to control for other covariates. But I think in many cases, especially for nutrition for health and long-term outcomes, that's the best it's ever going to get. Am I wrong?
No. So, yeah, it's spot on. I mean, we have a situation where the early infancy of nutrition as a science was very much oriented toward identifying nutrient deficiencies, tend to be single nutrient deficiencies. And they have a couple of characteristics. One is that they'll, like an infectious disease, similar to what we see with something like COVID, if there is a prevalence in the population, it will be evident in everyone who achieves that state. So the prevalence is high. The latency period is really short. It doesn't take a long time in that insufficiency and deficiency state for symptoms to manifest. And once you replete people with that nutrient, they recover quite quickly. And epidemiology in that context can be incredibly useful because things are happening quite quickly. You can identify things quite quickly, and you can also know through epidemiological means that your experimental interventions, for example, adding iodine to salt, or fortifying milk with vitamin D, or fortifying flour with vitamin B3, you can know that these are successful because you eradicate the prevalence in the community pretty quickly. So you don't necessarily need a randomized control trial. And the other point that really obviates the need for an RCT in that context is the reality that, unlike other areas of biological sciences, if you're investigating a drug, for example, you need to prove that the drug has efficacy. Well, that nutrients have biological activity is an empirical fact. We don't need to prove that vitamin E has biological activity. It's a question of how and in what context that biological activity becomes relevant. And I'll come back to that because it's really relevant for a lot of null findings in RCTs that people then assume means this nutrient has no effect, which is actually an untenable conclusion. So, but fast forward to now, and all of the conversations that we're having are in the context of chronic lifestyle diseases. These are conditions with long latency periods where the processes that influence the disease are at play way before there's a diagnosis. I mean, we know now from the mechanisms of atherosclerosis that process can begin from the second decade of life. But from our teens, we can be developing and initiating the processes that will 25, 30, 40, 50 years later manifest as coronary artery disease. We know that type 2 diabetes is the same. And these conditions that were a neurodegenerative disease, we have this increasing prevalence. We've populations living longer, greater incidence of dementia and Alzheimer's. And obviously, nutrition is not the cause, but it is a factor in the pathogenesis of these conditions. These are really difficult to study in a long-term context because nutritional practices early in life can influence the disease at that point in time. So to take a cohort of the population and to analyze their diet when they're 30 or 40 or 50 at baseline and to follow them for 20, 30 years is the best tool investigatively that we have to look at the relationships between nutritional exposures and disease outcomes, or health and disease outcomes. And this meets a lot of cognitive dissonance. And people, we're going to need long-term RCTs with hard endpoints. I was like, okay, well, let's just brainstorm that for a little bit, just to kind of see how essentially untenable it is. Now, usually when we do RCTs, particularly in the biomedical context, you want to look at the effect of manipulating one exposure, right? You want to hold these other exposures constant. It's like, okay, well, I want to look at the effect of 30 grams of fiber a day on heart disease incidence. But you don't want to necessarily have that in such a context where other aspects of the macronutrient profile of the diet aren't matched in an RCT now. And you also probably want to even think about carbohydrate sources, right? Because different fiber types, non-starch polysaccharides, other aspects you probably, because of what we know about the gut microbiome, want to think even about non-nutritive compounds like polyphenols, right? So great, you do this 12-week RCT where you've matched, or even shorter, where you've provided food and you've matched all these variables and you found an outcome, right? And people will say, right, you see, this shows X. Well, no, it shows X in that context. If you want to then extrapolate that out to assume that the conditions of that study would hold true over 30, 40 years, well, then you have to assume that all of the conditions that it was conducted in would hold true invariantly for that 30, 40-year period, which is, just even thinking about it, a completely untenable position, right? I mean, people change what they eat day to day. So cohort studies prospectively have a number of advantages. They minimize recall bias and factors. People are investigated prior to having a disease. We know that when people know they have a disease and they're investigated, they might change their answers. There'll be less jellies on the food frequency questionnaire. And they also get a general dismissal as being inaccurate. It's like, okay, well, compared to what, right? So no one with, any sort of brain would dismiss the relationship between, say, LDL cholesterol and heart disease, right? You have to be in a very, very special camp of people to do that. And very few people, to no one, again, would debate the predictive relevance of hypertension for disease outcome, from vascular disease in particular, stroke. No one would debate the predictive value of blood glucose for diabetes, right? And yet the strength of how those measures correlate to at a population level in terms of accuracy is on a par, and sometimes for the nutrients, they're higher with most of the macronutrients that we're interested in. Total fat, carbohydrate, saturated fat, polyunsaturated fat, sugar, protein, a little lower. Most of what we're interested in nutritional epidemiology, major macronutrients and otherwise, and their determinants, have the same validity or correlation, strength of correlation, as other health measures that are completely uncontroversial. Mm-hmm. Yet somehow nutritional epidemiology is this hocus pocus inaccuracy, but yet LDL is predictive of heart disease 20 years in advance. So there's some logical inconsistencies with people who argue that nutritional epidemiology is especially kind of inaccurate. And it just, again, comes down to, and it's quite obvious when someone really doesn't actually have any grasp of, dietary assessment methods or anything to do with nutritional epidemiology anyway. So, the reality is there's a pragmatic reason why prospective cohort studies are not going to go anywhere. But many of the more dismissive criticisms of this investigative tool come up a bit wanting in terms of their veracity.
I think it also really depends on where do you start, like with what do you initially bring to the table. So a lot of the things that you said are uncontroversial, are things that, and probably shouldn't be, I should preface, things that people don't question, and maybe they shouldn't, because like you said, we can't take the position of ignoring all of our basic understanding, like bench research of the role of, say, vitamins, and then see an 8-week RCT and go, oh, vitamin E doesn't do anything. Like, that doesn't make sense. It has a biological role in the body. I would say an equivalent that is something that I've seen in the research is that hypertrophy has no role in strength. That's been something that's been questioned because the change in that value compared to strength over time is quite small. And if we don't see correlations in that strength score, okay, therefore it doesn't have a causative relationship. I think that's an untenable position, because how could the contractile units and it's very difficult to have a mechanistic understanding of skeletal muscle physiology where hypertrophy has zero relationship with strength, So I think that's just like one other way of looking at that. And I bring that up just because I know a lot of our followers are aware of that kind of debate and are interested in it. But they may not be following things like diabetes or health research as far as nutrition follows. But if you think about it this way, dear listener, there's supplement research is actually much cleaner than trying to figure out the much more important roles of nutritional manipulation over time in populations, because you can have a zero exposure group that is getting, creatine, and the other group, well, I should say supplemental creatine. Maybe that's not a good example since we get it from meat. But you could study vegetarians. There's many ways to do it with supplements to where you have a near zero exposure in one group versus the other group getting it, and you are not dealing with things that have a long latency, like you said. But people don't die from 8 weeks of changing their nutrition slightly from chronic lifestyle diseases, and so and even if you did want to do that 30 grams of fiber group, it's actually pretty hard to construct a diet that has 0 grams of fiber. And it doesn't even happen in the real world in any population that I can think of. So it's a very challenging field once you enter it. And if you're coming from the quote unquote evidence-based community, where observational research only gets you so far in any conversation because of our basic heuristic understanding of that evidential hierarchy, it's easy to mistake. Like what do you do? Throw out the entire field of research? Like I don't think that makes sense, right? Or now all of a sudden we know nothing about nutrition. And I've seen the same thing with people misunderstanding qualitative research, because that's something we just don't touch on at all in kind of the evidence-based community. Don't understand the value of it. Of course, we can sit there and have this kind of, I don't understand it, reading this qualitative study, but we will also say, oh, and it's important, that other third stool leg of the evidence-based practice of having, the client's personal preferences, individualism, like that is qualitative research, just not published. So anyway, just some examples.
It is. And I think qualitative research is a sore missing link in nutrition science. I think it's a bit of a failing of the field. I can't fathom how something that is inherently behavioral and attached to numerous layers of an individual's self-construct, be it religious, cultural, regional, even now, environmental, ethical considerations, all of these variables. And we do these interventions, wonder why there was a 50% dropout rate, and we've just never asked the question why. So I think that is a missing link in nutrition. And I think that from an RCT perspective, I think pragmatic trials so when we just think of RCTs, we tend not to even realize there's a continuum of types of randomized controlled trials. Most of what we're talking about are explanatory RCTs, where you're looking to explain whether there's a relationship, and even to explore whether it's a cause-effect relationship between a given exposure and an outcome. But you can do pragmatic trials and so you're trying to control, there are certain characteristics that you really want to meet in order to have that conclusion with an explanatory trial. But with a pragmatic RCT, you conduct that study in the real life context in which the intervention will be applied. So you don't blind. Researchers know what they're giving people, and the participants know that they're getting, olive oil that they need to consume that week. But it's done in the clinical context in which the intervention will be run. So you're not necessarily coming out of it with demonstrable causality, but that isn't required. And this comes back to this point between observational research and epidemiology and RCTs is people are really hung up on the concept of causation, and unnecessarily hung up on it. We don't need demonstrable causality to improve the human condition. If we did, and you can test people's consistency with this with the example of smoking, and it's becoming a bit of a played out example, but it's an incredibly valid one. Most people, like, I can't imagine anyone now that would say that there isn't a causal relationship between smoking and cancer, specific, lung cancer in particular. And yet, there is no RCT that randomized people to 60 fags a day and a control group of 0, So we have the ability to use science and to use different methods of investigation to compile an evidence base that we then analyze through a set of criteria that allows us to come to conclusions about causal relationships. And we don't need demonstrable causality from some unicorn RCT that tells us everything we want to know. And people seem to be, sometimes I think that it's deliberate and tactical. So I think that there's people who use this, well, show me your RCT with, with death as an endpoint. And I think that's obfuscation a lot of the time. That's deliberate, and it's so you're in a conversation with people who are just simply not going to accept whatever it is you're arguing for, and they'll use that as a kind of really just an excuse to get around the conversation. But I do think there are a lot of people that don't fall into that bracket, that are trying to be evidence-based and that are doing their best to use these heuristics that we have, the hierarchy of evidence, to come to valid conclusions. And they might get lulled into some kind of oversimplistic thinking on some issues, without necessarily meaning to. And one example I can think of for this is the conversation around red meat. We did a big statement on red meat for Sigma. And, people have kind of, well, are you saying this causes? And I'm like, I'm not necessarily saying that. I'm saying that there are certain definable characteristics in the research at which there is a consistent risk. And that risk is demonstrable in different populations, consuming different diets. And so I'm not just saying risk in the most general sense of the word. I'm being very specific to over a threshold of around, it seems, 150 to 170 grams a day. And once you're over that, whether it's a cohort in the States or in Europe or in Japan, you'll see a risk. Now, what I can't say based on that is that there is no risk. And what people try and come back with is, here's this 12-week RCT. It found no effect. There is no risk. And I'm like, blood lipids was the outcome. So that you have to then make that assumption that that's the reason that there is an increase in risk, potentially. Two, you look at these diets, and going back to this idea of being able to nicely control everything in a 12-week intervention, often red meat might be the exposure of interest, but the diet has 6% saturated fat. That's even 50% still less than the average UK and US population diet. So they've controlled for the perfect diet, essentially, from a cardiovascular health perspective, with some red meat. And it's like, well, if we're assuming that blood lipids is the mediating factor, of course there was no impact on blood lipids, because it's not necessarily the red meat per se. It's the saturated fat content that would drive that. So people are coming back out with this short-term study to say this shows there is no risk. But it's like there's multiple variables at which that study doesn't even begin to extrapolate to what we might be seeing over 30 years. Mm. And one thing that, and this is again a methodological point, but it's important, but sometimes it can be hard for people to kind of grasp their head around. So I'll try and simplify it, but let's say you have 15 years of follow-up in a study, right? And what you can do when you're looking at the strength of an association over 15 years is you can eliminate certain follow-up periods, right? And usually that's the first 4 years, say, or 5 years. The first few years after the study begins. And what you're trying to do by eliminating that period from the follow-up is eliminate any, what they call as like the unsuspected sickness phenomenon. So you might have had people that were like just about to have their first event, right? But you didn't know it at the time. You screened them, they were healthy, fine. They entered the cohort. So you're getting rid of anything that might have a relationship in that immediate time frame.
Something that was caused before the thing you were trying to observe.
Before the thing you were trying to tease out. Now, if the strength of your relationship, of your association, weakens after you eliminate that, what it tends to indicate is actually an earlier temporal relationship. There's probably stuff going on beforehand. But if it gets stronger, that indicates the opposite, right? That indicates that from a temporal perspective, the risk was likely accruing later in that 15-year follow-up period. Now, we're talking matters of years in prospective cohort studies. The practical implication of that is that a 12-week RCT, a 1-year RCT, is unlikely to be telling you anything informative about what the underlying kind of mechanistic reasons that are increasing risk are. So,
Alan, I think that's you mentioned that as a methodological point that may confuse people, but I think there's tons of examples where we can think of that. Like, for example, most people develop Alzheimer's in their 60s or later. Most, of course, is early onset. I would ask the audience if they think that Alzheimer's is completely related to what happens in your 60s and later. I think most people would probably say no. I would suspect like how active you were, how much you challenged your brain, lifestyle, diet, all these things for your whole lifespan played a role. And if you hold that to be true, and you have also found yourself in a situation where you slammed down like it was Uno, an RCT on protein. And I've done this because I have biases towards protein because I eat a lot of it because I want to be jacked, and I'm sure we all have. It's a good one. It's a useful one because we all share the same bias and unity. We don't want protein to have any negative effect on our health or our livelihoods, because even if it did, we'd still be eating it. And we don't want to have to admit that we care more about our biceps than our lifespan. Because I mean, honestly, like, do you want to be alive a long time with small biceps? You probably shouldn't. And if you do, you're a bad person. But nonetheless, exactly, but in all seriousness, like, so if you've ever been like, no, I got this 1 or 2 year long study, shout out Jose Antonio, and they didn't find any metabolic markers related to issues of a high protein intake, then it is safe for 40 years. Then you made that same error of saying nothing you do until your 60s impacts Alzheimer's. So I think we all do it. And I think that that's a really important aspect of this conversation. Alan, I realized I did cut you off midway to explain something. Was there something else you're building towards that I...
No, I think that was perfect. I think it helps to add some analogy that's useful, and particularly if that's, like you said, the protein thing is probably something listeners can all grab on. And yeah, you're absolutely right. That's a great example of this idea that, well, we now have to assume that these conditions hold true over time, right? And so it's not that, and again, the problem then is people are like, well, which study's right and which is wrong?
Yeah. Nihilism is a very understandable reaction to the conversation we're having.
Right. And the answer to that is neither have to be right or wrong necessarily. Neither are probably wrong necessarily. They're both giving us some data point that we can take back to. And it was just funny. I got so bombarded with links to that article after it was published, being like, "Are you saying meat causes heart disease or cancer?" And I was like, "No, I'm saying there are thresholds at which there appears to be no risk or low risk, and there are thresholds at which there seems to be at risk, and that risk is consistent, and you can't, for the reasons I've outlined, just dismiss that risk and say there's no risk based on some 12-week study of X amount of red meat in the context of a diet that had 35 grams of fiber and 6% saturated fat." Like, you can't tell me that this perfect diet that no one eats in the population with a little bit of red meat is an example of how red meat increases risk in populations like the US or the UK.
Absolutely.
And as a kind of, just to round this out in terms of this idea of, getting people comfortable with the idea that it's not about deciding which study is right or wrong. In medical sciences, there's this really famous example of what is generally taught to med students, although I have a friend that's gone back to medicine and I've heard they've actually updated this, which is good. But historically, this was taught to med students as the reason observational research is, quote, wrong and RCTs are right. And it was to do with hormone replacement therapy. And there was observational research that suggested that HRT might be protective against cardiovascular disease. And then there was an RCT based on that observation that actually was terminated early because it seemed to be showing the opposite. And so this was offered as, the epidemiology led us to believe this was a benefit, and the RCT showed us that actually it was an increase in risk. And this is the dangers of observational research. Actually, both studies were correct, right? When you reconciled the observational study and the RCT relative to the timing of HRT initiation relative to the onset of menopause. So when you factor in those two variables, the timing of HRT onset relative to the timing of menopause, both studies found the same answer. But no one did the due diligence to reconcile that until about 10 years after the RCT. I was like, well, hang on a minute. I think it was in 1997. This was in the late 80s. I think it took to 1997 for someone to be like, actually, both these studies were right. We took the hierarchy as sacrosanct and static as opposed to dynamic, and came to a conclusion the conclusion was incorrect. Both studies gave us something that was valuable, and because of methodological prejudice, people didn't do the due diligence to dig into both to reconcile the inconsistency between the two. I just see this all the time with conversations about nutrition. I see it in particular a lot with the conversation around sodium. It's like, here's a salt loading study in 22-year-old bros, and they didn't get blood pressure raised. Therefore, and it's just like, no, that's not, that doesn't extrapolate to the effect of chronically high sodium on these systems of water balance, extracellular fluid, vascular effects, etc., over 40 years.
Alan, I think a big part of it is that this is a challenging conversation that we'll probably need to continually have, because in many ways we're working against, at least, I'm not sure what the chicken or egg is, whether it's the signaling and the stories that quote unquote influencers or promoters of information or people selling stuff or anyone who is trying to promote a certain thought pattern or idea, or if it's what people are asking for, and those people who are creating ways of thinking are responding to the social pressure of showing confidence and telling simple stories. But Omar, I want to ask you, because I think there is no more place that I find this more obvious than YouTube, where the recipe is very simple. First you get the algorithm by just doing something controversial, right? You draw a lot of eyes, you have a very clickbaity title, you get an emotional response from your viewers, but then the way you build and keep people is by being extremely confident and telling simple stories. And this is something that seems to be what people are behaviorally drawn to, that they want tight, simple, and easily constructed narratives that they can put the full weight of their belief behind. Am I wrong, Omar?
So, Eric, I just want to say before we go on, Alan, I think you're absolutely crushing it. And I think I'm also experiencing the exact same attack as Eric by big government causing massive leg on my side. So if I'm silent, it's not because I'm disinterested at all. In fact, I want to give you the platform to properly express yourself. And I think you're doing a fantastic job. But I'm experiencing the same thing as my man, Eric, just on occasion. So if it takes me a second to respond, that is why. That is absolutely the case, Eric. I was going to make the joke to Alan, that surely we never see this on social media where someone will seek to find sources to confirm their bias. I mean, it never happens. And also, more than that, I think the pertinent question here would be, for most individuals, are they looking to expand their critical thinking, or are they seeking to have simple answers so that they could get on with their quote-unquote very busy lives, where they want to know, they want to hear something, and they almost want it to be confirmed. And we see this time and time again in an unregulated, as Brad Schoenfeld would say, the personal training industry, or now, just the fitness industry at large. You could say anything without any consequences. The anonymity of the internet, right? Think of someone that's living in common. You could say absolutely horrendous things. So I know individuals, fellow content creators, where either themselves or other people get death threats for saying something not even what we would regard as being controversial. Like, I'm talking about reps in reserve, like something that seemingly would be so, once again, inconsequential and so non-controversial, that why would it provoke that response? But I think the anonymity, and then also people want that confidence in their leader. So we still have that leader mindset where we want someone to follow. And so you want that belief. And if anything, it almost seems hypocritical to change one's position. So simple narratives, and then doubling down. And also it's a weird phase that we're in, I would say, overall with content, people producing content. A non-apology is better than an apology in this day and age. In other words, doubling down on your position or showing yourself to be strong, right? So strength is in committing back to yourself. So instead of being flexible, inflexibility is what's in vogue. And we've seen, Alan, so unfortunately for you, Danny, Eric, you kind of see the downstream effects. Like I see some of the sources, and I think I'm not trying to get even deeper here, but because some of the algorithms have eclipsed our biology in the sense that the marketing is better than what our innate response to kind of think about it, pause and reflect for a second. Wait a second, should I even click on this? A thumbnail that seems over the top and gratuitous and makes me want to click, or the same idea when we had James Krieger on and he was just joking around, but he was positive. He put forth that obesity might be one of the results of capitalism. Just the idea that marketing has eclipsed our ability to resist it, right? The same idea with the algorithms, that we as content creators or just content creators in general are rewarded for these mechanisms. So it's not like, oh, the bad guys are winning, like they're coming over and they're just giving these narratives. It's almost like the system is set up so that those with those tendencies will do better because we have some of those biases within ourselves.
Yeah, no. I mean, we're rewarding an outrage culture, and I think unlike a lot of other, shall we say, natural experiments, so to speak, or times in human history where there was some great leap in technology that then drove this period of kind of innovation. Most of those pivotal moments in terms of the developments were still relatively slow. Like if the Industrial Revolution and the steam engine, that still was something that we can keep abreast of developments. Yes, it's changing the face of people's lives in a generation, not in 2 years, 5 years.
Yeah.
And so with social media, because we were all so in love with this idea of connectivity, we let the horse bolt off without the cart. And now we're just grabbing on for dear life, getting dragged through the mud by the horse that's still trying to tell us it's for our benefit. And I don't know personally how to resolve any of this. I made a decision a long time ago with my kind of, I guess, science communication. I don't like that term for multiple reasons, but I decided I was going to keep my avenues small, so I don't have a Twitter account. I decided I was going to use Instagram pretty much exclusively, despite people being like, "Oh, but like you should come on Twitter because there's more credible people on Twitter." I was like, I don't think that's a valid, it means nothing if the conversation's that deplorable.
Alan, the best way to learn is to listen to 3 different academics yell at each other with a limited number of characters and then a lot of retweets. And also, it's the best way to reach a large audience who's not on a platform is to use that platform. So if you want to get kind of the same way academic publishing already works, I want 5 people to read, my colleagues, the paper I wrote that is supposed to impact the entire society. Get on Twitter and just publish in high impact journals, and that's all you need to do. Sort of.
And Alan, just real quick, we got on Twitter, and now we're appearing for our episode 100 on Joe Rogan. So if you ever want to really make it, because it's all about that visibility, dog. Like we sold ourselves a long time ago. Twitter's the one for sure. 140 characters. Okay. We can express everything we're feeling.
I don't know. Yeah, exactly. 140 characters just seems to bring out the worst in people, like when you're confined to that. But I focused on Instagram for a couple of reasons. One was that I could control the flow of the content. 2, with stories, you could go a bit deeper into what you were trying to explore and explain to people and post graphs and all this. But more so, what I did was made a kind of really conscious decision that it was not going to be lay viewing. I wasn't going to explain what a triglyceride was. And if someone wasn't able to keep up or didn't get that, that was fine by me. And I was making a kind of conscious decision to do that so that I kind of gravitated a certain audience. And that's worked. Thankfully, it's curated an audience where most people that are following me are either nutritionists, dietitians, nutrition professionals, broadly speaking, medical professionals, then a lot of people in the fitness and strength industry. And then the lay people are scientifically literate. They either did some sort of kind of undergrad degree or something like that, or they just have a real interest in this stuff. So they're able to follow along. And that's been really productive because It means that I don't really have to engage in some of the crazier conversations. And a lot of the dialogue that I have with people is really productive. But it also means that I kind of decided that maybe in this whole space, as we try and navigate ourselves and produce content for people that's reliable and that they can then use, that there were probably various places for us depending on what we enjoy doing in terms of content creation and information dissemination, and B, where we can be useful for people. And I never really had any interest in practice. My interest is really purely the kind of the science side of it. So for me, it was, all right, if I can make sense of this for people that are in the trenches themselves, you know, in a private practice or whatever, and that they can use that, then that's my job done. So I kind of just took a step back from trying to. There's a few debates that naturally over the last kind of year and a half I've found myself in, but for most part I try and avoid debates because particularly online you're not really going to resolve them. I mean, me and Danny had a big back and forth with one of the kind of big lipid skeptics from the low carb community, and we did a podcast. We wrote a follow-up kind of rebuttal of the claims. There was a back and forth on that, and that was actually, you know, an enjoyable process because, you know, the guy in particular was very respectful. It was enjoyable. There was no shouting. There was no histrionics. There was no nothing. So that's fine. But like a lot of the time, you see the ugly side of it, and I'm thinking in particular recently. Yeah, and I saw this, when was it? A couple of months ago anyway, maybe October. And I kept getting dragged into conversations around polyunsaturated fats, toxic food industry, and all these kind of narratives that interweave into this, like, you know, animal fat was healthy, food industry paid Ansel Keys to demonize it, and now we're here and it's in our food and it's killing us. And
that's a great American accent, I just want to say real quick. I actually liked it.
And I couldn't understand how, you know, and I would just get someone would throw some rat study at me from 1970, you know, and trying to even explain that, you know, mechanism doesn't equal effect. Here's human research, blah, blah. And it was pointless. Like, why, you know, because that goes back to this heuristic we were talking about before we started recording of the difference between kind of forward moving scientific thinking versus backward moving belief scaffolding.
That's actually exactly where I'd hope we'd go next, Alan, because this is an interesting situation where those people would be better served by being introduced to the evidence hierarchy, because some of those errors they were making would be, you know, decreased to some degree. They'd make other errors, like we kind of front-loaded this podcast with, but they'd probably be closer to the ballpark of reality. When we had Dr. Ben House on, he talked about some of the most common, I'd say, science obfuscations of telling these simple stories that people are attracted to is starting with, you know, mechanism, a little bit of fear, appeal to authority, and then boom, we get things like we're talking about. So now what you were just starting to talk about, which I want to kind of preface and then hand it back over to you, is building back from a conclusion. So Omar, when I kicked it over to you to ask about kind of YouTube, I think the things that are rewarded make it more and more and more difficult for people to, like you said, people are no longer apologizing. They actually get more out of doubling down, even when it's pretty clear for anyone who's logical that they're incorrect. And this is true intellectually. It's not just true in terms of how do you get more views or followers or subscribers or build an audience, that the more you have built up underneath a worldview or a way of seeing things, even if it did come from an evidence-based perspective, quote unquote, or what you think is evidence-based, the more difficult it is to then reverse course in the face of contrary evidence. And the more likely you will be to try to search for something to confirm your bias, because if your biases, which has now become the scaffolding and the house of cards around you, is wrong, you have to say a lot of things are potentially wrong, and you have to, quote unquote, question everything. So, and I think that this happens in the fitness industry a lot because people are so prone to selling methods or systems and then over emphasizing them or over claiming what they can do because that's what they're taught by marketing to do. So if you've had great success with a low carb diet or training to failure with low volume, and this is something that you come by honestly, it worked well for you. You have then decided to coach people that way. And for the people who tend to be drawn to you, probably because of your messaging and they've already had previous experience with it, they get good success. Your anecdote fortifies it. Then you start to make a YouTube channel, Instagram, and you sell products. And it's all based on building a following. And all these, you've now created an information bubble of people who share the same anecdotal experience. It backs up what you've experienced. And now you're selling stuff to people and you are looking for more and more scientific support. You've constructed a worldview. How could you possibly step away from that belief system? It's actually, I think it's almost going to be the rare person that's able to. And I think another way of looking at it, and I don't want to get into religion or politics, but more so use these as examples, is that if you have an entire worldview built on, maybe a way of seeing how life came to be, or the social hierarchy of the world, and you are presented with scientific evidence that seems to contrast that, you will do exactly what Alan was starting to allude to, is start with a conclusion and then find the evidence to get you back there. Because now when we start talking about religion or politics, it's far more than since you were 25, the way you've trained and this second career you've had after you left whatever you were doing in your early 20s and now you're selling ebooks. Now you're saying, I have to go back on what my parents potentially taught me, the way I've actually constructed my values and morality system, the way I see the world, who my friends are, my social group, my peer group, how I potentially even teach my children. So it's no wonder how difficult that is to change. And I think the term ideology is a useful one here. And I think it is what many people don't realize they have in our space. When you take a heuristic and you elevate it to a point of extreme confidence, that basically is an ideology. So and this is a little mini ideology of seeing the evidence hierarchy as the only lens to view. And I joked at it before as a sacred cow, and I used the morbid analogy of trying to use a safety blanket to stop a car from hitting you. I think the solution here, if there is one, is that when we're starting with how do I better understand rational skepticism, empiricism, and try to get closer to the truth and the way the world works, is you have to get really comfortable with only having limited levels of confidence, even when you're at the tippity top of that pyramid with the best evidence and very easy world problems that you're trying to solve with the evidence, instead of trying to just look for the new ideology or the new religion, as we talked about before on this podcast, and basically treating science as something that tells you the big T truth, rather than something that chips away at potentially untruths to get you closer to what's left. And that's a really, really challenging thing to do, and it requires vigilance on part of the person to keep doing that.
Yeah. I think part of maybe what has kind of led us to this path, like in society generally, I mean, we've seen enormous skepticism of science during the COVID-19 pandemic, largely because politics has used science as that safety blanket, even though a juggernaut was coming for it. And, that's been an unfortunate, deliberate scapegoating of kind of science and knowledge. But, the pandemic might have laid bare something that was already there. I think if we really trace back, this has been coming for a number of years. I think I read, it wasn't Robert Sapolsky. It was political scientist talk. It was a really interesting article about the concept of trust in public institutions and how countries with a lot of issues right now in terms of their politics, but just the social kind of ferment on the ground. The US is one, the UK is another. Mistrust of public institutions is a characteristic feature of many people in the population, and you contrast that with the Nordic societies or Germany, where there's a lot of trust in public institutions. There's a lot of trust in and you can contrast this as well with some of the Asian countries. And Eric, I mean, you're in New Zealand, so you know what it's like to be in a country that's dealt with the pandemic quite well. Trust, Taiwan, South Korea, like healthy democracies, trust in public institutions. And we have various forces that have chipped away at that trust, and science, I think, is one of the casualties. So there's an assumption that, the scientists are the kind of elitist ivory tower eggheads in the white coat telling us all what to do. And it's such a mischaracterization of science because, anyone that is a scientist tends to be inherently doubtful, inherently uncertain. and because they're true scientific thinkers, they are uncertain. It's possibly to their detriment in a way. It's possibly why there is this ivory tower impression, is because a lot of legitimate scientists don't really wade out into the public fray.
I think it's highly ironic that you said it's possibly detrimental to not have certainty. That's just amazing. I just wanted to highlight that. I love it. Carry on.
and so, and here we are, and we're trying to now, whether we're in nutrition, strength and conditioning, medical science, someone that tries to communicate about vaccine efficacy, for example, we're all kind of fighting little battles in our respective fields of trying to drive a conversation somewhere. And I think the reality is we're all coming to a similar conclusion that it's largely futile, which is quite frustrating. So we're either doing something wrong. Part of me thinks that, again, coming back to this idea that, well, it wasn't science that got people to these belief systems. So we probably need to be converting what we know from science into attractive narratives, stories, and these various kind of cognitive communication constructs that humans actually like and appeal to. But it does, I think, with the there's one side of it, which is the skepticism and the kind of the woo and the more nefarious manifestations of this. And then there's the slightly kind of less obvious, potentially a little more pernicious aspect, which we see within our own fields. And this goes back to that idea we were talking about earlier, where true science is something that you move forward with. It's forward moving. You look at an observation in the natural world and you come up with a set of predictions and hypotheses to explain that, and you test them, and then you move forward with what stood up to the scrutiny of the test, and you discard what didn't, and then you look to see whether what you think you're seeing might actually have some evidence from other ways of looking at the problem, other lines of inquiry. And if they all start coming together, you think, okay, maybe we're closer to this approximate truth, knowing that there is never 100% certainty, and knowing that true scientific proof doesn't actually exist. So we're coming to an approximate conclusion that we can then apply to improve people's lives. And then what we're combating, because everyone has access to PubMed and because everyone's got a book by some doctor or whatever, they're capable of arriving at a conclusion and working backwards, building this scaffolding we've been talking about. So they're in this rigid structure, and humans don't want to ostracize themselves from the tribe. They're not going to knock down their own house. So we're in a situation where we're in a conversation with someone who is waving papers, waving what they think is science, or certainly that they are convinced that these belief scaffolds that they've put up are scientific. And maybe there's the odd good study there, but by and large, the difference is they moved backwards to find that study with the intent to prop up their scaffolding, as opposed to finding it moving forward and being like, okay, now I can add this data point, but I know that this isn't sacrosanct. It's simply one piece in an overall puzzle. And I don't know yet how we coax that person out. They're not going to knock down the scaffolding themselves. And I think what we've got to do is to try and coax them out of it and realize they can probably just walk away from it and leave it there. And then ego isn't attacked. But that's really difficult to do. And I don't know how we do that in the social media information age. Yeah.
It's not all bad, Alan. Yeah. I will say that. I think the fact that that someone like yourself is using Instagram to communicate to a science literate audience tells us that these are there is that the horse that's telling us this is for your own good, that's pulling us into oncoming traffic. He's not completely wrong if we survive this next red light. But I think it's absolutely a challenge. It's absolutely very difficult. You're basically using trickle-down science communication. So, best U.S. President Ronald Reagan just helping you out there. So, but in all seriousness, I think it is absolutely a challenge. And I think what you're talking about is that we probably, again, I think it comes down to being comfortable with being uncomfortable. And Omar, it actually reminds me of a podcast that you probably wouldn't expect I'm going to shout back to, but when we had Dan John on with Matt and Susie, and he said, if it worked, I'm right. And he's speaking as a coach who had to make a decision. And there is maybe there is, in the multiverse, a parallel version where a different decision was made and we could see that outcome. But, until we can, peer through the quantum foam into the alternate string theory reality to see what Dan John's other decision resulted in for his shot putter, we're not going to know if he made the best choice. We just know whether it worked based on what he did. And then he is right because, like you were kind of alluding to, Alan, it is the sufficient truth for the given context of what we can have. And I think ultimately that's what we need to be trying to look at. That, like you said, kind of the flexible way of looking at that evidence hierarchy and applying it to different situations where potentially trying to go up that rung of ladders is going to remove an absolutely key quality of what we need to study that topic, like a 20-year study time. Can't do it in RCT. Don't climb up the ladder. It's just going to go off a cliff. So in the context of I'm working with athletes, I only have one athlete, don't have the quantum foam peering device. Yeah, I made a decision. You either improved or you didn't. And that is the correct decision. Am I going to say this is the thing to do for everyone? Well, if I have an Instagram account, I'm selling an ebook, yes, but I shouldn't, right? And I think that's an example of if you are as comfortable as you can be with that decision as a coach, for example, you only need to care about, and you can only extrapolate to that given context, which is I made a decision for Tom, the shot putter. He threw further. That was a good decision. So this is true as an effective, a sufficient stimulus for this person. But I should not say all shot putters should do this in this context. And I should not say that this is a causative mechanism for increasing shot put throw. Like if I was to walk up to a shot with no one touching it, and I told it the same thing I told Tom, it would start moving and defying the laws of physics. Like, no, obviously we can't start to go down that rabbit hole. Funny thing.
That's coaches being scientific in their thinking, usually, often maybe without even realizing it. It's like, okay, I tried these variables. I found this thing or this set of conditions in my athlete made them throw further or run faster or jump higher. And I stuck to that. It's just like the fact that you got to a point where you'd played around with different exposures and variables and to elucidate a set or one particular factor that improved outcomes. Like that's scientific thinking, Well, it's not an RCT, but it's applicable in that context. And it's this idea of truth and objective. I've actually been having this conversation with a few of I started in law before moving into science. I was having a conversation with a few of my old law buddies, and these conversations tend to be very kind of existential, epistemic about truth and whether objective truth is even like a thing or is required, or does it even exist, and is it a problem even trying to focus on it? And the reality, I think, is that like all of these things that we're talking about, evidence or the concept of verifying something, there's the standard of proof, for example. There's a continuum, right? There's a spectrum, and not everything has to be objectively true. Okay. It can be true in a very certain context, a very limited set of contexts or circumstances. And that's not objective truth because it wouldn't hold true invariantly. But we do have objective truth. We have this amazing story that I love about Einstein, and I think it was in the 1930s, and he set out the various mathematical criteria for a black hole to exist. And he also set out the criteria that would disprove it, that would falsify this idea. Now, he never had the first picture of a black hole was not taken till last year, till 2019. And yet the predictive power of an objective reality allowed him to predict that such a thing would exist, and also predict the circumstances that would make it not exist. So there is objective truth. And there's a useful heuristic, I think, that helps people maybe delineate between this idea of objective truth versus true and circumstantial kind of truth. There was a trial. I came across the story in a kind of a back and forth commentary about RCTs and kind of evidence. And there was an experiment in India in I think Bengal, the province, a number of years ago in the 90s. And what they were looking at was to see whether the leaders of the local authorities, right, the local councils, if having a female leader altered the provision of essential services and the way that the council kind of distributed things like water and otherwise. But to avoid it, reverse causality, like more progressive places electing a female leader, and therefore it was just because the place was more progressive, they randomized which places would have female leaders. And what they did find was that there was a more equitable distribution of resources in these local council authorities, or counties, I think they would be in the States. So is that objectively true? No. Like, could you assume that if you had every county in California or Alabama have female, like, would that hold true there? No, of course not. It's particular to the circumstances in Bengal at the time, and it doesn't hold true invariantly. But gravity is an objective truth. In more controversial issues in sports science now, biological sex is an objective truth, and we have to navigate social issues coming into and having friction with sometimes objective truth in order to be able to come to good outcomes and conclusions with a lot of these hard questions in society. And so there is objective truth, but not everything has to be objectively true. And we have most things that we're interested in terms of health sciences are largely circumstantially true. A lot of them, as the epidemiologist Kenneth Rothman and Sander Greenland talk about this causal pie. You have a pie and it has multiple slices to it, and you could have a causal mechanism in that pie, and it could be causal in and of itself. But you also could have other factors within that are assisting or moderating the operation of that cause. And this is something that I've got into a bunch with kind of cholesterol skeptics. And they're like, well, how can cholesterol be causal if inflammation also matters, or triglyceride also matters? And it's just like, because they're in the pie. They don't invalidate that a causal relationship between LDL and atherosclerosis exists. They just modify the size of that effect, or how early or late it occurs, or the process. But that causal mechanism exists one way or the other, and the pie just fleshes out how big the effect is, or these other factors that come into the treatment picture. But for most of us, like the idea that you would get stronger from just deadlifting with the same sets and reps and exposure, there's a causal pie of factors that go into increasing your deadlift, or increasing some sort of work capacity, sports specific skill or otherwise. And I think that a lot of, again, coming back to one of those themes we started with, a big part of the problem in a lot of these conversations is people are looking for certainty. And particularly in the conversations about nutrition, they're like, you can't show causation. I'm like, I don't need to. and that's the problem. And if someone can't kind of wrap their head around the idea that you don't need to show demonstrable causality, certainly not to improve population health, like is Chad walking around at 10% body fat, eating all his fruits and vegetables, does he need to worry about eating 8 grams of salt a day? I don't know. I mean, maybe not. Maybe not at that moment in time. Maybe if he does it for 40 years, it could change. But does he need to worry about it at that moment in time? Maybe not. Does that mean that reducing the overall exposure to sodium in the whole population won't shift the bell curve of risk for stroke? No, it will. We know that. So that happens a lot in the nutrition conversation, is this complete conflation with individual level risk versus whole population risk and exposure.
Yeah, it happens all the time, man. Like I'm thinking, with what I often deal with, and I do think it's important because there's a lot of, some people are more risk averse than others. So kind of this is where that qualitative aspect comes in. And they're more likely to have not only an emotional response, but a stronger emotional response to hearing something that may have some relative risk. And when that happens, they're more likely to have a binary thought process, because that's the way emotions work, in response to finding out there's risk. So, and when I deal with that, I kind of have to, when I respond to that, I should say, as someone who is discussing science with someone, I have to be able to give space for that, hold space for that, instead of just being more dismissive and you're making them feel condescended and only just triggering them emotionally more. And then, of course, saying facts over feeling and blaming it on them and proving to myself that I'm essentially not emotionally intelligent. But here's a great example. Like, there may be a study that shows epidemiologically that there is a higher odds ratio of all-cause mortality for having a diet that includes red meat. Like you kind of alluded to that earlier, Alan. And someone who is not risk averse, doesn't really want to change their lifestyle, and is all about the proteins, is going to make the fallacy of going to, well, there's no RCTs that show that, I'm all good, carry on. Someone who's much more risk averse and is maybe a little bit older, or has had someone else in their family die of something, or has found out that, I'm not Chad at 20. This is Chad after he has 4 kids and found out that, oh my God, my blood pressure's high, right? And he's like, oh, I'm actually, health is now elevated in my priority as I'm sensing some proximity to death approaching, as I'm not no longer at 10% body fat in Cabo. But this person might look at that and go, oh, I'm staying away from red meat, and then get pretty hyped up about it. And I'm going, well, hold on, Chad. Like, the odds ratio only shows like a 10% relative risk increase for an absolute risk. That means you're more likely to get hit by lightning. So it's there, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything. Plus, here are all the moderating factors, having a high fruit and vegetable intake, being active, having a low body fat, having a good social support network. You got all of those. So I don't even think for you it's actually an increase at all. If I had to bet money, you're probably not going to die of that. It'll be something else, So
you'll die, dude. Just won't be that.
Yeah, for you, you're only going to have a relevant odds ratio of one terminal disease, because you only die once, But I think that's really difficult for people to understand. They're probably going to naturally want to go to either one side or the other. The 10% increase in an absolute negligible sense in risk, never going to eat that again. Or I'm not at the point in my life where I'm worried about health. Let me find a way to work backwards, as you're not supposed to do with science, as you clarified, Alan, to find a way to still hold the belief that what I'm doing is perfectly fine in all contexts and is for everyone.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that's, I think, possibly one of the most difficult parts generally with scientific discourse. Around health. Yesterday, because again, going back to that, I'm fortunate I have a pretty scientifically literate audience, and I'd seen a friend of mine do this kind of, not a medical doctor, soon to be in medical school, but it did a poll, who would get the COVID vaccine. I did phrase the question for the poll as who would get the Bill Gates microchip installed. So
I signed up immediately, by the way. I hit yes on that poll.
Great.
Even without the vaccine, I would get that, because I want Bill to know where I'm at.
I want to walk around with, I want to be Wi-Fi. So I want my microchip, and I want Bill to grow me a tail once he can control me.
I want to get that Skype update that actually makes Skype worse just 10 minutes earlier than everyone else. That's just what I want personally.
Yeah. And so, and you know, like it was 80-20, you know, which I was kind of surprised at the 20, but it turns out I actually had a lot of people then message me and be like, oh, I said no, but I'm pregnant, or I have an autoimmune condition, and like really valid no's. But we did, you know, get into some of the other stuff. Was it's a 98.2 survival rate. I was like, okay, fine. Extrapolate that to a population the size of America. 300,000 dead. There's 50,000 dead in the UK. Like, that survival rate extrapolated to a whole population level is not trivial. These are enormous numbers of people that have died. And I don't know whether we're sensitized to just death or destruction as societies now, but I just can't fathom the relative lack of genuine shock in wider society for these numbers. You know, even in the UK, you know, comparing those numbers to, say, Vietnam, which was transformative for America and, you know, US society and the US psyche. Like, it means fourfold higher numbers, and yet we're kind of like, oh, it's 3. That's a number, right? Yeah. So this.
Well, I think that's exactly it, Alan. Is that we're not able to make some of those simple emotional connections to numbers past a certain point, unless we have been unless we've trained ourselves or been trained to do so. I think that's a huge part of it, personally. Yeah,
and so it's very difficult to then think about that at a level of individual risk. You know, it's very difficult to be like, well, I had multiple people who were like, well, look, I'm 28. I'm really fit. I eat a great diet. I sleep 8 hours a night. I'm like, that's all great. You're probably really low risk. You're not no risk. You know, we look at the published reports of these kind of adverse sequelae of people who are in this low risk age bracket and are now experiencing post-viral fatigue, memory, potential neurological complications of COVID and otherwise. So it's not a free lunch to be infected. Sure, a lot of people, it will be, you know, they'll be infected, they'll have symptoms, they'll recover, they'll be fine. So it was just so clear to me how difficult it is for people to compute that kind of risk, and to compute the individual risk and then contextualize your individual risk to wider society. And certainly it gave me more of an appreciation for how, you know, for nutrition, it's very difficult for someone at the age of, you know, 20, 30, whatever, doing all of this stuff that may serve a particular purpose for them at that time, either just enjoyment, or maybe they just don't care, or maybe it's all physique focused, but they haven't eaten a gram in fiber in 7 years, you know. So all of this kind of stuff, it's very difficult to say to them, you know, you don't really eat much fiber. You know, colorectal cancer is a big risk in 20 years' time. Like 20 years, you know. So yeah. I think there is a cognitive bias to this. I can't remember the exact term for the fallacy, but you see it as a cognitive construct in smokers, for example. It's like you see it in soldiers going into combat. I know someone will get it, but you know, it won't be me.
Yeah.
And this ability to defer the idea that you're going to be and again, I try and compute things that way for people when we do talk about some of these nutrition exposures. And someone said to me there was a series of kind of meta-analyses, woohoo, top of the pyramid, that came out last November by this group called the Nutri-Rex Consortium, which sounded really impressive, but was basically just a bunch of people who made up a title for themselves. And did a meta-analysis on red meat and various outcomes, cancer and cardiovascular disease. And one of them, this is where the difference between absolute and relative risk becomes important. So someone said, well, the absolute risk change, I think it was colorectal cancer, the absolute risk change was 1 per 1,000 persons. And I said, okay, the US or the UK population, it was a UK kind of conversation. I said, 67 million. So extrapolate that one extra diagnosis per 1,000 people, extrapolate that up to the whole population level. 67,000 extra diagnoses of colorectal cancer. The absolute rate for total cancers was 18 per 1,000. I was like, now extrapolate that. So this is where we get into more difficulty, because if relative risk can appear to overinflate relationships sometimes, then people can do the opposite because it fits their bias with absolute risk and say, well, this change is actually minuscule. And it's like, for you as an individual, sure. For the whole population, no. So they're completely, and again, one isn't right and one isn't wrong. They're just different contexts in which we have this discussion about whether something is an exposure of relevance or of interest or something we need to think about. And individual level considerations and population level considerations are going to be different, and that's completely okay. It just depends on the context in which we're talking about these things.
Alan,
No, that's well said. Go ahead, Omar.
Yeah, no, I just want to say quickly, when you brought up COVID or the pandemic, and especially you're joking, talking about like the 20-something-year-old, it's like, yeah, but this isn't going to affect me. 2020 is the year that if it doesn't personally affect you, if it's not within your perspective, within your little bubble and you can't see it, then surely it must not exist. And I do find it kind of crazy to me that the individuals are saying like, yeah, but I'm not at risk. It's like, it's not about you. You understand you do exist in a society, and you're actually increasing the risk of someone else who could have very serious consequences. And from seeing the people, once again, the younger individuals, let's say, it's like, once again, why is this relevant to me? It's like, yeah, your little social media bubble that you have, or a fellow 20-something-year-olds, 30-something-year-olds. Again, it's not about you in particular. It's like, but don't you have someone that's either older, or the comorbidity factors that they might be at increased risk that you might know? It's like, nah, I just deal with myself or people like me. And because I haven't seen it, shit, I don't think it's real.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Well, I think a good chunk of this too, we've been talking about these cognitive biases, and one of the biggest ones with social media is the availability bias. It's what Daniel Kahneman refers to as what you see is all there is, and that's the way we're built to work. And I think it's a challenge, and to work around that on your own level. And I think it'd be useful some ways to assess whether you've taken a heuristic, which are great. And again, as a reminder to the audience, a heuristic is a hopefully useful lens of viewing the world through a certain understanding. But as we know, due to the statistician box, that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. That's basically what we have here. It's a model, a way of viewing things, and it is potentially useful, but it is absolutely not infallible. And if your tendency towards having confidence in simple stories, this heuristic elevates itself to that of an ideological kind of view of the world, that's a problem. But even more problematic, and what I'm getting at, is you don't know when that happens. It happens not to your conscious awareness. It starts to subvert your willingness, I would say, even to engage the part of your brain that is actually logical and assesses the evidence and then reformulates its worldview on a kind of ongoing, rationally skeptic, updated basis. To use the example that I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of, I think politics is a really useful one, because as someone who has spent his entire adult life studying nutrition and training, I know what goes into having the level of understanding that I do of that research, and knowing how to construct and reconstruct my beliefs about certain things as the evidence comes up. And I know that I don't have the capability to do that with political science, because I'm not a political scientist, and that's okay. However, what that means, though, is that I should not have the same level of confidence in my political beliefs that I might have about certain exercise science or nutritional science theories. And here's a way to test that for yourself. And I actually do this with myself, especially when election year comes around. I assess whether all of my political beliefs fall along the same ideological spectrum, because then I know that I'm carrying something that's incorrect, because that's just not the way the world works, right? So, for example, let's say you had we're talking like early days libertarian worldview, to where everything comes down to like property law. And this was before, like, say, climate change, or even just, non-controversial, at least politically, aspects of the environment, like the fact that plastics are building up in the ocean, right? And the whole basis of it is based on, all right, I have my property, you have yours, and that is, I'm king in my own domain. So let's say you both live on a river and I throw plastic into the river and it's on my part of the property. With a purist view of that kind of libertarian ideology, somehow that plastic doesn't pollute anyone, and it would be a violation of my rights to tell me what I can do with my plastic on my property. But we know in the real world that plastic is going to go into the river and go and build up and cause public issues. So if you have a worldview that may be logically consistent, and hey, there may be plenty of times, I would say I can think of many social areas where a libertarian worldview is arguably a very positive thing, but applying it to something like property, like the view of property towards public space and plastic pollution is a really simple one where you go, obviously that's not good. Or the very useful idea that everyone has inherent rights, like the whole concept of the Bill of Rights. Like, we have unalienable rights that should be protected. And that will, if you have an ideological lens to that, that solves all problems related to welfare. Well, what do we do with animals, right? So if you own an animal and you view animals as property, in that worldview, there's no solution to animal suffering. There's no punishment. It's not the government's role to step in, because no one's freedom's being infringed. So on your property, you're allowed to torture animals. That's not a world I want to live in, right? So if you can sit there and you look at all your political beliefs and they align perfectly with one ideology, you know that you have some things that are incorrect. And that's the point where you need to go, okay, well, before I do something like vote or make a pivotal decision, I need to actually spend some time and try to engage with some research, or listen to at least like kind of what most people do in the evidence-based community. And off camera, we talked about the difference between being science-based and evidence-based. I'd say most practitioners in the evidence-based community, they select numerous people who present themselves and attempt at least to be, honestly, as unbiased science communicators who do what you or I do. And they kind of survey all the different arguments and beliefs. And when there is conflict, they make their best assessment of who is being more logical and who is arguing in best faith. Or they just simply stand in a place of not knowing, which is great. And I encourage that. And I think, like, we don't do that with politics because it's emotionally charged. We don't do that with religion because it's emotionally charged. We don't do that when things are presented on social media because it's emotionally charged. And guess what? The mechanisms in those spheres, the reward systems, the people who hold power don't really want you to do that, because that's the whole way that they're using to persuade you. So that's one of those self-tests. Has a heuristic elevated to ideology? Go ahead. Yep.
Right. No, it's spot on, because it is, what you're describing in that idea of everything aligning up on a certain ideological bent is, in effect, it's analogous to what we were saying about something holding true invariantly. I've seen this and this. So it's basically taking the ideological framework and saying, like, this is my heuristic through which everything gets processed to a certain point in conclusion. And I think the analogy to politics is useful, because that's probably where we can see how people get stuck so easily. Have either of you read Strangers in Their Own Land by Arlie Hochschild?
No, but I have read Strangers in a Strange Land by Heinlein, which sounds like it's been alluded to in that book.
It could be. It's the book I kind of wish everyone in the States read after 2016. But Arlie Hochschild is a Berkeley sociologist, and seeing the writing on the wall, rather than kind of pontificate from the academic ivory tower, she spent 5 years living and traveling to the Lake Charles region in Louisiana, getting to know people, Tea Party members, and devoutly Christian, and yet all around them, they're literally their homes. Like, there was a sinkhole that sucked people's homes into the ground because of bad drilling practice, unregulated. Or you had a scenario where the former now governor of Louisiana, in order to attract petrochemical companies, offered a 160 billion was the total pot of money to essentially attract companies to locate there. But in order to raise that money, he gutted 40% of the funding from the Louisiana University state system and high school education and a bunch of other, and fired like 30,000 nurses or something like that. So basically all of the money came from like, education and healthcare. And so you're reading about this. They know this is happening, right? They're seeing the environment literally get destroyed, like their homes sucked down in sinkholes, pollution to the point where they can't fish out of the river anymore. And they know all of this is coming directly from policies, yet their belief systems, which is a mix of kind of religious plus kind of like political outlooks, means that they can't actually join the dot between what's literally happening to them physically in their daily life versus the actual policies that are resulting in this happening. So, when it comes to climate change, it's not necessarily that there's a denial of science. It's that these are people who are so devoutly on the far end of the kind of Christian fundamentalist spectrum that they think the rapture is happening anyway. So world's going to end soon. So, and it's like, this is so they're having their actual reality is clear to them. They're not ignorant to the fact that their environment is destroyed, the rivers are polluted. The local governor is more interested in getting chemical companies and drilling companies to come, who will then do this and exacerbate the problem, but yet mention regulation, mention state support for healthcare, mention anything like that, and they can't join the dots. And so
it's big government.
And it's right, yeah. It's all and it's a book well worth reading, I think, because she writes with incredible empathy, which again has been sorely lacking in the political conversation in the US and in the UK. Post Brexit, the conversation here has been just hideously divisive, and so you're seeing people who, they, like if you're using the UK example with Brexit, like they can see what's coming. Like they know this is going to be an absolute disaster, yet they're so clinged on to this opaque idea of their sovereignty, they actually can't connect these dots. So I do think that the political and religious and kind of wider social analogies are really useful and even perhaps more important than the context in which we're discussing this scientifically, because, it would be great if everyone built a bit more muscle and got a bit healthier and ate more fiber. But, the reality is all of these questions are not necessarily inseparable from each other. The average diet of a family in the bottom 25% of earning in the UK is pretty much identical to the same in the US. And we can talk relative risk, absolute risk, sodium, we can debate all this stuff till the cows come home, but like the reality is all of this stuff is intertwined in terms of the kind of political, social, religious and scientific. So as long as we can see that these heuristics do actually help one lens to view things through the other, then I think we can get to a place where we start to actually unify them a bit more, so that there's an overlap, almost like the Olympic rings all rung together, and then we've got some sort of collective way of moving forward. So I've never viewed these things as inseparable as you might kind of gather from some of the Sigma podcasts, where we end up highly focused on socioeconomics and political factors, because they're all intertwined.
And they're useful examples, because I think when we're in the midst of a debate, and you are like, if we do a podcast on carbohydrates, you enter the discussion probably with a certain viewpoint. Hopefully you come into it like, I'm going to try to blank slate this as much as I can and just learn and listen to both sides. But, most people, and I'm one of them, when I hear, X person and X person are going on this podcast to debate, like, you got them, insert person who I have a viewpoint. But I think the ability to use tangential examples from an unrelated but more emotionally charged and more relevant to almost everyone field to show where ideology fails us, or to show how, I think more importantly, an ideology can short circuit your own logic, I think is helpful. Like one I'll often use, a political example, is like kind of the general Republican ideology. And I know I've used multiple examples that are a little more like anti-right wing, but that's not intentional. And I could definitely come up with ones that are on the left as well. And this is more of like a right wing in the States thing. It doesn't make as much sense if you're not in the U.S. But here's a very common one: is that most people who believe in the Second Amendment of protection of gun ownership as a method to overthrow a potentially tyrannical government also tend to be okay with big government only in the military sector. So they want a smaller government, and that is absolutely consistent with a worldview of wanting to be able to personally bear arms if that big government does get out of control. But they seem to be totally fine with more military spending, and they want to have a strong military. So to me, like, what does that logically tell me? If I was to assume you're completely logical, my assumption is that you want to be able to overthrow the government, but you don't want it to be easy. Like, you want a challenge. Like, you want to be able to have, an AR-15 but fight a tank. Like, you basically want to play on the opposing side in most, first-person shooters. Like, you want to be the person who loses. So, and I don't think people think about that. They have this an ideological belief that is, okay, big government is what people who share my ideology say big government is, and it's tyrannical. But the most obvious place of tyranny, of exerting force, is somehow exempt from tyranny, which I think is just a really, really easy example.
So is healthcare in the U.S.
There's a few in the U.S.
that pointed this out to me, because Austin works in the public health sector, but also works within the military medical establishment. The U.S. military healthcare is a socialized healthcare system.
Yep.
Right. It's one of the best healthcare. If you're in the military in America, you get socialized healthcare. You get the best hospitals. There's no waiting list. The equipment's amazing.
It's pretty good. I was in the Air Force. It's pretty solid. It's good, but it's
damn better. It must be, that by the sounds of things, than the public sector, particularly if you're in an area where it's underfunded.
It's certainly better than paying $5,000 for an ambulance ride that lasted 5 minutes.
It's that logical consistency of it's generally going to be the same people. The type of political orientation you're describing is going to be someone who's just like, well, the government shouldn't help with healthcare, but I support the military. And it's like, well, yeah, you've got a massive, potentially tyrannical organization, coupled with socialized healthcare, like a kind of a Danish, Norwegian-esque healthcare system that does exist, just in a certain context that people are okay with it. So yeah, I think that the political consistency. I mean, I've seen that here in the UK with the Brexit conversation, and right-wing writers or conservative writers. I'm keen in the modern context with how divisive to distinguish between like conservative with a small c, traditional conservatism, just stability and low taxes and this kind of stuff, versus kind of right wing, and maybe not lump them in together if I can help it. But both sides here have talked about this idea of regaining back control from the tyrannical yoke of Europe, and it's all about the sovereignty of Britain. And within that, anything that has seemingly stood in the way or been seen to stand in the way has been labeled like, enemies of the people, and this really emotive rhetoric in the press. And last year, the government here basically unconstitutionally decided to shut down Parliament, right? Which they didn't have. And it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that was idiotic. You can't do that. And suddenly the Supreme Court were being attacked in the conservative and right-wing press here as like enemies of the people standing in the way. And it's just like, these very same writers are the ones that go on about democracy and sovereignty and how everything should be democratic. On the one hand, they're singing about democracy as if that's the pride of place that they care about. And on the other hand, they're attacking an independent judiciary, which in the context of separation of powers is a fundamental core pillar of democracy. So it's just this complete inconsistency in the rhetoric. So I think you're right. I think it becomes a really useful heuristic to be able to allow people make sense of some of this stuff, the difference between ideology and how problematic viewing things first and foremost through an ideological lens can be. Because ultimately you either sound silly, come to some really poor, half-baked, or even flat-out dangerous conclusions, depending on what the subject matter is, and leave yourself no room for maneuver in terms of flexibility. And so that's the nice thing about uncertainty, is that we can always be flexible. Yep. And we can always modify that position within whatever we've been talking about.
Now, I'm going to pull the most Canadian move and not only not step into the political discussion, but also change the topic into something that I think will give us a good sense that there might be hope. Where we're talking a little bit about nihilism, I wanted to say, when you're talking about objective truth, there's something I want to touch on maybe as our final topic, Alan. And that is, I would consider you more of a purist, Eric to a certain extent too, where you're trying to chase after that objective truth or communicate with more science literate people. And so then you see from that bubble, there's the much larger bubble of just the general masses. And then you see social media and you see individuals producing, by and large, bad content. And I do think there is a pause for hope, though. And what I mean when I say that is that there are different levels. And if all the levels work together, I think you can almost have a unified front to provide overall better information. Here's exactly what I mean. Is sometimes you have to understand some of the systems in order to, essentially manipulate them and use them to your advantage. Case in point, we talk about that objective truth, but then there's also what I'd call in social media true enough. So the heuristics, right? So when you're trying to communicate large-scale information to the masses, you have to simplify it to a way that you're not getting a lot of noise. The signal's still there, the fidelity's still there, but they can understand it. And that's where I have to give a shout out to individuals on the front line, if this is a war, to individuals like Jeff Nippard, where he knows properly how to use the thumbnail, the title, to be very attractive. So people that, what I joke with Jeff now, because we're training together, are science adjacent. So they're like, in the realm of one, they're almost like that.
It's a great term.
Not even quite Neil deGrasse Tyson, right? So it's not even the people that would attend one of those lectures or one of the videos and be like, yeah, man, I'm all about this. It's people like, yeah, I understand it's a good idea to be a little bit more rational. I don't really know what that means, but I'm going to listen to you because I want to hear what you have to say. So he brings in hundreds and millions of people. So this is large scale now. He's one of the most popular fitness content creators. So he uses some of the similar mechanisms. So the thumbnails, the titles. If you look at his editing style, it's extremely crisp. It's very professional. He does it in such a way that's very engaging. So he's using from the outside some of the similar things, the drapes that people see. But then he's also hidden them with really good information. Now, we had a conversation, and this would be better to have Jeff on, so I'm not just speaking for him. But we were joking where I said, Jeff, like out of, 500,000 people watch your videos, and you're talking about reps in reserve or whatever topic. How many of that 500,000 do you think are actually absorbing the core points? Not everything, but just like enough to be able to incorporate into your training. And we were joking because he would say like, he would get a fan come up to him, and the fan would say, man, I watch all your videos, and now I know about the importance of constant tension. Jeff's like, what? I never have said, not only have I never said that, that's a complete misrepresentation of everything I'm about. Now, I think it's very important for all this to work to have individuals like Jeff on the front line communicating to the masses, but then also some of that knowledge then percolating as people become more interested, giving then the opportunity for people like you, Alan, people like you, Eric, to communicate to the masses. And then there's a certain subset of the people. So we got 100%, maybe 20% are kind of like, oh, okay, wait, Alan, what's he talking about? Or like Daniel, chrononutrition? That sounds interesting. And slowly the science literate people become more science literate. And from that point, those individuals attempt to educate other people. But the question that I was going to ask you, Alan, because myself and Eric have had this conversation before, is how does one determine, or how do you determine then your time, what you decide to dedicate? Because kind of what you said, there are people that are deeply entrenched. You could try and roll around and wrestle in the mud. So you can try and have a debate or a conversation. A debate, someone must be declared a winner, so it's never usually productive because both sides are really charged, and by the end, my guy won or your guy won. Cool, whatever. You can try and have a conversation with people that are more entrenched and you're trying to convince them, or you could kind of double down, is what you're saying, on your audience. So you're really a little bit more of a purist. And so you're trying to educate them. And then from there, they're kind of proselytizing, to use a little bit of a religious term, the masses again. So you're hitting them hard. You're keeping it pure with your information. And then they go out there. Or you could once again try and make your things more accessible. So Eric has done that with the muscle and strength pyramids, which, hey, if anyone else used pyramids, we're suing their asses. Or then there's other communicators, and I'm not naming names, who wrestle for the exposure, right? It's like WWE, it's mud wrestling against my favorite guru against your favorite guru. Let's wrestle, let's see who wins. So I'm wondering from your perspective now, when you said, don't go on Twitter, I don't disagree. But with the time that you can spend and the level of knowledge that you have, I can only assume that you feel the podcast, you doing it with Danny, is a very good idea. But where do you think dedicating your time as a communicator is most productive?
Yeah, I think so. In terms of, is it worth getting in debates? I don't think so. Not anymore. I think when I was new to social media, I maybe kind of carried a bit more chippiness and kind of wanted to. And you know, and I maybe it's useful. I don't know, but I think. And Danny's recent podcast episode with David Robert Grimes, he talked about this a bit. There's people that are dyed in the wool with a given belief system, right? It's futile trying to reach them. It's absolutely futile trying to engage, debate. They're never going to come around because there's far more at play in their cognitive constructs in terms of why they believe these things, and it has a lot to do with like in-group narcissism and these kind of like more nefarious traits. What I try and do with the more public side of stuff, the social media, is I've realized that there's a huge subset. I don't want to say silent majority because I don't know that it's the majority, but silent large group of people, silent cohort that are listening, that are interested, that haven't come down either way, largely because they're confused. And what I realized is engaging with the message that a lot of these groups put out rather than the messenger allows me to address it in a way that the people, this silent cohort listening, would benefit from. It's their attention I want. And it's their it for me, particularly with social media, I see that as an opportunity to kind of like demonstrate your integrity in breaking down science. So what I try and do if I'm communicating a particular study or otherwise is never just do that didactic ivory tower. This study found this, or I think good science communication and good understanding of your field means that you don't just show or say, what was found, but you should be able to demonstrate why a study shows what it does or doesn't show what it does. And so that's on the social side. But in terms of where I think my time is definitely best spent, I do think it's in trying to synthesize these topics and issues for people that can carry that information into the trenches, as you say, so to speak, or into their practice, into even just their day-to-day life. So I don't see it anymore as engaging in debates and trying to reconcile this stuff. It's the idea of trying to reconcile people who think the carb insulin hypothesis. Is it like, what am I doing? There's so much more time that could be better spent talking to people about why X study did or did not show what it did, why this body of evidence says what it does or it doesn't show, and trying to help people differentiate some of these concepts we've been talking about today between individual level risk, population risk, relative risk, absolute risk, so that they've got this better kind of grasp of understanding within it. And usually that's trying to bring people to the middle ground. So yeah, I think for me, it's communicating to people that probably have some basic grasp of understanding. If that means that I reach less people, that's fine. But if I give 20 people a really solid understanding of whatever it is that we're talking about, and they spread that on to 20 more people, then that's the win. So that's the ripple effect. It's the dropping of the pebble into the pond. I see myself as the pebble dropper.
You're like an infectious disease spreading.
Basically,
yeah.
I'm SARS-CoV-2. Highly contagious. Silent. I'm not silent on anything.
And the only vaccine is ideology to you.
Right. Yeah.
That fits with us, though, Eric. You know, Alan said a lot of wise points. He spoke about the concept of working backwards, but what we say around here, Alan, you might not be aware of this. This is a cult, okay? There is theology here. There are codified laws, tenets that are immutable. Anything after that is up for debate. But once you try and get to the top of that pyramid, who's at the pyramid? Who's at the top of the pyramid, Eric?
We are.
Holding hands.
That's right.
Double bottom.
That's right. So, I mean, like basically what Omar's saying is we are all for rational skepticism as long as it doesn't threaten our duocracy. Exactly. At the height
Alan,
of the Iron Cult. So, yeah, we have conditional support for you being on. I mean, the beauty of it is that if we have someone on Iron Culture to talk about rational skepticism, you have implicitly implied that everything we say is correct by coming on our podcast and correct. So we've truly subverted and appropriated science for our own means, and I just want to say thank you for helping us do that, Alan. This has been a wonderful conversation. I'm going to coin a new term that may not be new because I haven't checked, but I'm going to assume that I'm the smartest person ever. If I said it, that means it's the first time.
Sure.
I think people need to have confident uncertainty, because to pay more reparations to Ireland, when we had John Kiley on, he talked about that once he became more rationally skeptic in his practice as a sports scientist, he went through this crisis period of feeling unable to do anything because he didn't know if anything he knew was true. And it disabled him, and it emotionally damaged his athletes because he was like, oh, I don't know, like nothing works or everything works. I don't know, you know? And I think that there's a flavor to that where it comes from fear, where you're exposed to your undergrad, and maybe especially like in the periodization realm where he operates, a lot of emperors with no clothes, in my opinion, who have constructed entire like decade-long houses of cards built on assumptions. And when that goes away, you're left with this huge gap. Like, oh shit, what do I know? So instead of it being a kind of that fear-based, because honestly, John did a lot harder work than most people will ever do, is he did realize I've been moving backward. Now I need to dash what I thought I knew and move forward. And that eventual period he got to is now he has a lot of confidence because he's okay with sufficient truth in the context he's in. He's okay with he has confidence in his uncertainty. He knows the extent to what's reasonable to know in any given context, instead of willingly, taking the blue pill or the red pill, whichever one keeps you in the matrix. I don't know. He took the wrong pill, right? Don't take the wrong pill, folks. And going, you know what? I'm okay with having a level of confidence in something that might be wrong. So what I want to encourage everyone is to do some of those self-tests. See if you do have these ideological beliefs that have crept into your psyche, masquerading as heuristics. See where there's room to be worked on that. See how attractive are these simple stories to you? How much do you want to have these confident opinions? And then I would say, as a daily practice, work towards being confident with uncertainty.
Yeah, I like that. I think I heard him talk about that before. Was it on Danny's, on Sigma maybe a while ago? And because there is a very definitive point of moving towards, better knowledge in any given field, where you can cripple yourself, absolutely paralyze yourself in the ground with uncertainty.
Yep.
And it's not the uncertainty that's paralyzed someone or literally, stopped their ability to function. I mean, we even see this in sports. There's a term in baseball for it, isn't it? I don't follow baseball enough, but like when people like can't throw a pitch anymore. So I can't remember what that is.
Yeah.
But this idea that you absolutely completely paralyze your ability to function because you're questioning everything about what you know or how you think you operate. And it's not the uncertainty that got you to that point. It's the way that uncertainty has been met and the mindset that uncertainty has been met with. And I think for a lot of people, they'll probably maybe have to go through a little bit of that process, but that's healthy. And, I definitely, particularly like with something like a PhD, where I try and keep my interest in nutrition as broad as possible. But for the purposes of a PhD, you have to go down the rabbit hole in a given area. And so it's very easy in the rabbit hole journey to get to a point of being like, I know nothing. Right? Yeah. And that could be crippling. Rather, I think the part that people need to reassure themselves with is that's a really nice place to be. Because what will come out of the back of that I know nothing is I know something, and it's okay that the rest is still to be filled out. And that so confident uncertainty, I think you can enter that into the OED, hopefully. I think it's a great addition to the vernacular, and I will be using it going forward because I think it's a great way to describe how we should be approaching these things.
I would be happy to license that to you for a price we can negotiate off air. Yeah, but honestly, I think that is it's a fantastic place for us to conclude this conversation. Alan, it's been a true honor. I think the way you both think and communicate your thoughts is something many should aspire to. I do hope all dear listeners benefited from this conversation. Might be one you should listen to twice or even on a regular basis, just because we have to continually recheck these cognitive biases. And with that, Omar, I'm going to pass it off to you because I know you know how to close out any episode. No matter how amazing it was, you always make it more amazinger. So I'm going to hand you the baton right now.
The end.
Grand.
Well done.
Well, Alan, I just want to echo what Eric said. Peace.
I was on recent. There's a skit from a video at home, and it was just like the guy sitting down teaching someone how to like speak Irish for a citizenship exam, and it's just like, what do you say when someone tells you that they've experienced? And it's all this like horrific shit, like sexual abuse, and it's just like grand.
Perfect. And honestly, that's even a better way to end it, is to end on an Irish anecdote to show that we are still culturally sensitive. Omar?
Not appropriating.
Not at all.
No.
Because you're here. You make it okay, even if you didn't say it was.
I believe you're our fourth Irish guest because I forgot about John Kiley. So we've paid our dues, and now we can say carte blanche in the next episode, whatever we truly think. So I feel liberated in some sense. Alan, I want to thank you for being on. We'll make sure to link all that hot social media in the description, including the non-existent Twitter account where people can wage eternal war with you or just debate about various things that are inconsequential. Why not?
Exactly.
People can leave a rating and review. If you want to help us out, okay, it's suggestive around here, Alan, what we want them to say and what we want them to rate it as. It's 5 stars. You can leave any rating you want, but we know the one that we're after. On YouTube, we do our best to respond or sometimes just ignore you, just to play hot and cold a little bit. But one thing is certain in this life, if you want an objective truth, we're back every single Monday now until the end of time. You ask how that is possible? Well, when myself and Eric leave this mortal coil, shrug it off, it's going to be a new age. So now until the end of this era.